Hello everybody, welcome back to History of Briggs. My name is Briggs, and today we'll be talking about how the Ohio and Michigan rivalry began, the Toledo War. Well, let's get right into the video. In 1787, the Congress of Confederation enacted the Northwest Ordinance, which created the Northwest Territory. The ordinance specified that the territory was eventually to be divided up into not less than 3 nor more than 5 future states. One of the boundaries between them was to be an east and west line drawn through the southerly bend or extreme of Lake Michigan. When Congress passed the Enabling Act of 1802, which authorized Ohio to begin the process of becoming a U.S. state, and the northern border at the western part of Lake Erie, an east and west line drawn through the southerly extreme of Lake Michigan, running east until it shall intersect Lake Erie, or the territorial line, with British North America, which is now Canada, and thence with the same through Lake Erie to the Pennsylvania line aforesaid. The Mitchell map of the region, which was made in 1784, was used to create an ordinance line of 1787. The southern tip of the Lake Michigan is depicted as being farther north than Lake Erie. The most highly regarded map of the time, the Mitchell map, showed the southerly extreme of Lake Michigan at a latitude north of the mouth of the Detroit River, suggesting that an east-west line would not intersect with Lake Erie at all until well across the international border. The framers of the Ohio 1802 Constitution, therefore, believed it was the intent of Congress that Ohio's northern boundary should certainly be north of the mouth of the Maumee River, and possibly even of the Detroit River. Ohio would thus be granted access to most or all of the Lake Erie shoreline west of the Detroit River. Ohio would thus be granted access to most of the Lake Erie shoreline west of Pennsylvania, and any other new states carved out of the Northwest Territory would only have access to Lakes Michigan, Huron, and Superior. However, the delegates allegedly received reports from a fur trapper that Lake Michigan extends significantly farther south than had previously been believed or mapped. Thus, it was possible that an east-west line extending east from Lake Michigan's southern tip might intersect Lake Erie somewhere southeast of Maumee Bay, or worse, might not even intersect the lake at all. The farther south that Lake Michigan actually extended, the more land Ohio would lose, conceivably even the entire Lake Erie shoreline west of Pennsylvania. Addressing this contingency, the Ohio delegates included a provision in the draft Ohio Constitution that if this report about Lake Michigan's position was correct, the state boundary line would be angled slightly northeast so as to intersect Lake Erie at the most northerly cape of the Maumee River, which is now the Maumee Bay. This provision would guarantee that most of the Maumee watershed and the southern shore of Lake Erie west of Pennsylvania would fall in Ohio. The draft constitution with this provision was accepted by the United States Congress, but before Ohio's admission to the Union in March of 1803, the proposed constitution was referred to by a congressional committee, and the committee's report stated that the clause defining the northern boundary depended on a fact not yet ascertained, which is the latitude of the southern extreme of Lake Michigan, and the members thought it unnecessary to take it, as in the provision, at the time into consideration. When Congress created the Michigan Territory in 1805, it used what the Northwest Ordinance said to define the territory's southern boundary, disregarding that provision in Ohio's state constitution. This difference and its potential ramifications apparently went unnoticed at the time, but it established a legal basis for the conflict that would erupt 30 years later. The location of the border was contested throughout the early 19th century. Residents of the port of Miami, which would later become Perrysburg, urged the Ohio government to resolve the border issue. The Ohio legislature, in turn, passed repeated resolutions and requests asking Congress to take up the matter. In 1812, Congress approved a request for an official survey of the line, delayed because of the War of 1812. It was only after Indiana's admission to the Union in 1816 that work on the survey commenced. At that time, the border between Michigan and Indiana was altered from the Northwest Ordinance boundary over the process of the Michigan Territory, moving it 10 miles northward to give the new state substantial frontage on Lake Michigan. U.S. Surveyor General Edward Tiffin, who was in charge of the survey and was a former Ohio governor, employed William Harris to survey not the ordinance line, but the line described in the Ohio Constitution of 1802. And when completed, it was called the Harris Line, and it was placed at the mouth of the Maumee River, completely in Ohio, as intended by the drafters of the Constitution. When the results of the survey were made public, Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass objected, writing in a letter to Tiffin that the survey was biased in Ohio and, quote, is only adding strength to the strong and making the weak still weaker. But in all reality, the survey was in Ohio's favor, but because Ohio had already drafted their constitution stating that the border would start at the mouth of the Maumee River, and due to the War of 1812, the survey was pushed back. In response, Michigan commissioned a second survey that was carried out by John A. Fulton, and the Fulton survey was based on the original 1787 ordinance line. And after measuring the line eastward from Lake Michigan to Lake Erie, it found the Ohio boundary to lie just southeast of the mouth of the Maumee River in the region between the Harris and Fulton survey lines formed what is now known as the Toledo Strip. This ribbon of land between northern Ohio and southern Michigan spanned a region 5 to 8 miles wide, over which both jurisdictions claimed sovereignty over, and while Ohio refused to cede its claim, Michigan quietly occupied it for the next several decades, setting up local governments, building roads, and collecting taxes throughout the area. The Toledo Strip was, and still is, a commercially important area. Prior to the rise of the railroad industry, rivers and canals were the major highways of commerce. In the American Midwest, and a small but important part of the Strip, the area around present-day Toledo and Miami Bay, fell within the Great Black Swamp, and this area was nearly impossible to navigate by road, especially after spring and summer rains. Draining into Lake Erie, the Maumee River was not necessarily well suited for large ships, but it did provide an easy connection to Indiana's Fort Wayne. At the time, there were plans to connect the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes through a series of canals. One such canal system, approved by the Ohio legislature in 1825, was the Miami and Erie Canal that included a connection to the Ohio River and an outflow into Lake Erie via the Maumee River. During the conflict over the Toledo Strip, the Erie Canal was built, linking New York City and the eastern seaboard to the Great Lakes at Buffalo. The canal finished in 1825 and immediately became a major route for trade and migration. Corn and other farm products from the Midwest could be shipped to eastern markets for much less expense than the older route along the Mississippi River. And I do not know what's wrong with my voice and talking. I have read the script many times, and I am starting to lose my voice from it because we are having difficulties filming this. So if my voice keeps going down and worse and worse, now you know why. In addition, the migration of settlers to the Midwest increased sharply after the canal was finished, turning Buffalo and other port cities into boom towns. The success of the Erie Canal inspired many other canal projects because the western end of Lake Erie offered the shortest overland route to the frontiers of Indiana and Illinois. The Miami Harbor was seen as a site of immediate importance and great value. Detroit was 20 miles up the Detroit River from Lake Erie and faced the difficult barrier of the Great Back Swamp to the south, and it could not really be accessed by roads. And so a canal was key to this, and both states had much to gain by controlling the land in the Toledo Strip. In addition, the strip west of Toledo, the Toledo area, is good for agriculture because of its well-drained, fertile loam soil, and the area had for many years produced large amounts of corn and wheat per acre. Michigan and Ohio both wanted what seemed strategically and economically destined to become an important port and prosperous farmland in the South, and in 1820 and 1821, the federal land surveys had reached the disputed area from two directions, progressing southward from a baseline in Michigan and northward from one in Ohio. For unknown reasons, Surveyor General Tiffin ordered the two surveys to close on the Northwest Ordinance, or also known as the Fulton Line, rather than the Harris Line, perhaps lending implicit support to Michigan's claim over Ohio's. Thus, townships that were established north of the line assumed they were a part of the Michigan Territory, and by the early 1820s, the growing Michigan Territory reached a minimum population threshold of 60,000 to qualify for statehood, and when it sought to hold a state constitutional convention in 1833, Ohio was able to sway Congress, and they rejected the request because of the still disputed Toledo Strip. Ohio asserted that the boundary was firmly established in its constitution, and thus Michigan citizens were simply intruders, and the state government refused to negotiate the issue with them. The Ohio congressional delegation was active in blocking Michigan from attaining statehood and lobbying other states to vote against it. In January 1835, frustrated by political stalemate, Michigan's territorial governor, Stephen T. Mason, also known as the Boy Governor, because he was only 22 when he became governor, called for a constitutional convention to be held in May of that year, and despite Congress's refusal to approve an enabling act authorizing one, in February of 1835, Ohio passed legislation that set up county governments in the Strip. The county in which Toledo sat would later, in 1835, be named after incumbent, at that time, Governor Robert Lucas, a move that further ex- um, exacerbated the growing tensions with Michigan. Also during this period, Ohio attempted to use its power in Congress to revive a previously rejected boundary bill that would formally set the state border to be the Harris Line. Michigan, led by the young and hot-headed Mason, responded with the passage of the Pains and Penalties Act, just 6 days after Lucas County was formed. The act made it a criminal offense for Ohioans to pay out governmental actions in the Strip under the penalty of a fine of up to $1,000, which is equivalent to $30,000 in today's money, or up to 5 years of imprisonment and hard labor, or even sometimes both. Acting as commander-in-chief of the territory, Mason appointed Brigadier General John W. Brown of the 3rd U.S. Brigade to head the state militia, with the instructions to be ready to act against Ohio trespassers. Lucas obtained legislative approval for a militia of his own, and he soon sent forces to the Strip area, and the Toledo War had begun. Former U.S. President John Quincy Adams, who at the time represented Massachusetts in Congress, backed Michigan's claim. In 1833, when Congress rejected Michigan's request for a convention, Adams summed up his opinion on the dispute, and he said, quote, "Never in the course of my life have I known a controversy of which all the right was so clearly on one side and all the power so overwhelmingly on the other." And in all reality, this was not true at all. And acting as commander-in-chief of Ohio's militia, Governor Lucas, along with General John Bell and about 600 other fully armed militiamen, arrived in Perrysburg, Ohio, 10 miles southwest of Toledo. On March 31st, 1835, shortly thereafter, Governor Mason and General Brown arrived to occupy the city of Toledo proper with around 1,000 armed men, intending to prevent Ohio advances into the Toledo area, as well as stopping further border marking from taking place, and in a desperate attempt to prevent armed battle and to avert the resulting political crisis, U.S. President Andrew Jackson consulted his Attorney General, Benjamin Butler, for his legal opinion on the border dispute. At the time, Ohio was a growing political power in the Union, with 19 U.S. representatives and 2 senators. In contrast, Michigan, still a territory, had only a single non-voting delegate. Ohio was a crucial swing state in presidential elections, and it would have been devastating to the fledgling Democratic Party to lose its electoral votes. Jackson calculated that his party's best interest would be served by keeping the Toledo Strip as part of Ohio. However, Butler held that until Congress dictated otherwise, the land rightfully belonged to Michigan. This presented a political dilemma for Jackson that spurred him to take action that would greatly influence the outcome. On April 3rd, 1835, Jackson sent 2 representatives from Washington, D.C., Richard Rush of Pennsylvania and Benjamin Q. Howard of Maryland, to Toledo to arbitrate the conflict and present a compromise of both governments, and the proposal presented on April 7th recommended that a resurvey to mark the Harris Line commence without further interruption by Michigan, and that the residents of the affected area be allowed to choose their own state or territorial governments until Congress would definitively settle the matter. Lucas reluctantly agreed to the proposal and began to disband his militia, believing the debate to be settled. And 3 days later, elections in the region were held under Ohio law. And so now Mason just had to approve the deal, and the Toledo War is over. But he refused the deal and continued to prepare for possible armed conflict. During the elections, Ohio officials were harassed by Michigan authorities, and the area's residents were threatened with arrest if they submitted to Ohio's authority. And on April 8th, Monroe County Sheriff Posse moved into Toledo and began arresting violators of the Pains and Penalties Act, and the most publicized incident took place on the night of the Monroe contingent, numbering about 35 to 40 persons, entered into Major Benjamin F. Stickney's house and drove his two guests, George McKay and N. Goodsell, out of their beds, having first attempted to gouge out McKay's eyes and having throttled Stickney's daughter for sounding the alarm. They then carried the two to Monroe, had a mock trial, and released them on bail 2 days later. The alleged crime being interference with the arrest of the Toledoans loyal to Ohio. And, with that being said, Spriggs out.